Sharon, would you mind getting us started with the introductions? We'll go backwards
Sure.
this time.
I'm Sharon Denoa, the director of the South Bay Coalition on Human Trafficking.
Wonderful. And Ermelinda?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ermelinda with Community Solutions, the human trafficking services supervisor.
Wonderful. And I'm Kim. I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Services Program Director at Community Solutions, and I am very excited for us to be here to be able to really have a conversation and learnings about the intersections of criminalization and human trafficking, as well as with other forms of gender-based violence. Next slide. As you can see, we have a very full list of different individuals that'll be joining us both today and tomorrow to be able to talk on this subject. I'll make sure each of us can kind of reintroduce ourselves at the beginning of our talkings. But can we go ahead? Next slide. Just as an interview today, we're really going to focus on survivors. That is central to what we are doing. We really want to be able to identify those intersections first of different forms of gender-based violence, because an intersectional approach ensures that we are seeing the individual as a whole person for all of their experiences and being able to ensure they're connected to services that match those needs. And then taking a look at the intersections with criminalization and the impact of that trauma. Tomorrow, we will go more into the support and services available for survivors, but today is our focus on survivors. Some of our learning objectives, right? We do want for you to be able to identify the intersections of human trafficking with other forms of gender-based violence. I already said these things, but one of the things that's really important is being able to understand those resources, legal remedies, and support that is available, because we want to make sure that whatever door a survivor walks through, whether it's Community Solutions or another organization, that they're able to be connected to the services that they need. Just some quick group agreements as we move forward. Just as a note, right, because domestic violence and sexual violence and human trafficking are so prevalent, please assume, right, there are survivors amongst us, or that there may be individuals that know a survivor or that have seen those stories. So make sure to let's come in with that assumption. Some of the materials we may go over, they can be difficult to hear. So please make sure that you are taking care of yourself. If that means you need to turn off your camera, step away, whatever that is, please take that space. Also respect confidentiality, right? We want for the information that's said here to go out further, but not the stories or the experiences, personal experiences that are shared. Assume positive intentions, and then do not discuss any information about pending or open cases. If there are additional agreements that anyone would like to make sure we're able to add, please stick them in the chat, just so that way this is a space for learning and really being able to have those difficult conversations and open conversations. Next slide. All right, so let's get started. We are going to first go ahead and have an overview of gender-based violence. If we can go on to the next slide and even the next one. There we go. And I'm going to turn it over to Ermelinda.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started again. If you do need to take some space, please do so. So we're going to start off by talking about what is gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is deeply rooted in the social and cultural structures, norms, and values that govern a society where there is that imbalance of power that is carried out to make an individual or a group of people feel inferior or subordinate. So you'll see that the root cause of gender-based violence off this diagram is a toxic patriarchal society. And so we'll be focusing on sexual assault, intimate partner abuse, human trafficking, but these are just some of the symptoms of a greater issue. And so as you see here in the slide, there are so many other forms that take place, such as you see here discrimination, inequality, sexual harassment, child brides, female genital mutilation. Those are just some of the symptoms of a much bigger issue, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. Okay, so then there was a time when intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking were seen, as silos, as different forms of violence, but now we see that there are intersections. In fact, even within human trafficking, labor trafficking, and sexual and sex trafficking were seen differently than just like human trafficking. So we're moving away from that idea and shifting towards recognizing that there are intersections within these victimizations. Okay, so why do we screen for intersections? So we do this so that we can ensure that providers address different forms and intersections of violence and trauma to ensure that all survivors can explore all possible protections, both legal remedies and social benefits available to them. And also so that other services and programs, they can access those based on their individual needs and eligibility. So we might have a sexual assault survivor that may be eligible for human trafficking services, housing. And so we want to make sure that we identify those intersections because of that. And every survivor's situation may be different. They may have different needs. And so that's why we really need to identify, there may be a domestic violence survivor that intersects with human trafficking that may not just need legal remedies, right? They might also need to talk to family law attorneys because they share children with their abuser or trafficker. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is intimate partner abuse? We oftentimes hear intimate partner abuse. It's used along with domestic violence. So domestic violence refers to, it could be violence perpetrated within a family, from family member to family member. It can also be intimate partner abuse, but it's just an umbrella term. We're going to be focusing on intimate partner abuse. And so it's defined as a pattern of abusive behaviors exerted by one individual in order to control or exercise power over his or her partner in the context of an intimate relationship. These behaviors can be actual or threatened. They can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial, psychological, emotional. It can also be stalking. And it doesn't have to be perpetrated by a current partner. It could be a former spouse or non-marital partner, such as a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a dating partner. It could have been somebody that they dated just for a week. It could also be same or opposite sex. And so we'll talk more about this with this slide. This is a power and control wheel. It's a diagram of tactics that an abusive partner may use to keep their victims in a relationship. But again, they may no longer be in a relationship with this person, but they may continue to perpetrate, abusers may continue to perpetrate these kinds of abusive behavior. So as you see in this wheel, it doesn't just have to be physical or sexual abuse. It could be using coercion or threats. You know, if you leave, I'm gonna kill myself or hurt your family. Using intimidation could be anything from hurting pets. It could be punching holes in the walls, yelling. Emotional abuse too can putting somebody down, making them feel like they're not worth it. You know, making them feel like nobody will listen to them because they're not worth listening to. It could be using isolation, which would be, you know, what we see, right? Controlling who they talk to, when they can leave. It could be even as far as pushing people away to the point of intimidating. The abusive partner can be so intimidating that nobody wants to hang around the survivor. Everybody's turning their back on them, right? Because they're scared. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. You know, I didn't do it. I didn't hurt you that bad. Using children, if they share children, could be threatening to take the children away through the court system, threatening to turn the children against the other parent. Male privilege could be, you know, because I'm the dominant person, I get to make the decisions around the house. You have to do the work. And it could also be, we typically see that, you know, that's the case, right? That they get to make all the decisions, but it could also be, again, intersection with human trafficking, which, you know, they're taking all the income away, along with using economic abuse, right? They could be forcing somebody to be going to work and not allowing them to be in control of any of the finances or not knowing about the family finances. Okay. And so sexual assault includes non-consensual, completed, or attempted penetration of the vagina or anus, non-consensual completed or attempted oral sex, non-consensual intentional touching of a sexual nature, or non-consensual non-contact acts of sexual nature, such as voyeurism or verbal or behavioral sexual harassment. It can be perpetrated by anyone, a friend or acquaintance, a current or former spouse or partner, a family member, or a stranger. And so again, the next slide. So sexual assault, again, an umbrella term, it can be touching or non-touching. And oftentimes we think about, you know, sexual assault when it comes to those behaviors where there are touching, right? Rape, child molestation, sodomy, incest. But oftentimes, I think, you know, a lot of people forget that it can also be non-touching, which is sexual harassment, catcalling. It can be voyeurism or a peeper, flashers or exhibitionists. It could be obscene phone calls, or you know, it could also be being forced to watch pornographic materials. Okay, so now we go on to human trafficking. So what is human trafficking? So there are two types of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking refers to when someone recruits, harbors, transports, provides, or obtains a person for commercial sex acts by force, fraud, or coercion. When it comes to children, minors under the age of 18, commercial sex is always considered sex trafficking because minors cannot consent to commercial sex acts. Then we have labor trafficking, which too occurs by means of force, fraud, or coercion, and is when a person is subjected to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. And so we see that there's domestic servitude on here, and exploitation of labor. Those can sometimes, again, be seen as domestic servitude is a form of human trafficking found in the private residence. Debt bondage, slavery, peonage is when somebody is told that they owe either money or something in exchange for, being housed, or, they're deceived into thinking that they are in debt. So that's why it's considered labor trafficking as well. And so to understand human trafficking a little bit, I know it can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but in order to identify or kind of screen for it, you should know that there should be an action, a means, and a purpose. So human trafficking occurs when a perpetrator, which often referred to a trafficker, takes any one of these enumerated actions: recruits, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, and then employs the means of force, fraud, or coercion, by, causing or threatening serious harm, whether it's physical harm, sexual harm, physical restraint. And physical restraint could be, using psychological abuse, debt bondage, abuse of legal process, withholding documents. So there has to be a means, force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex or labor or other services. And so when we look at the intersections within intimate partner abuse and human trafficking, we see that we may come across a survivor who may identify as human trafficking initially, but they're also victims of intimate partner abuse, or vice versa. So we may come across somebody who is suffering from intimate partner abuse, while also being trafficked by that individual. And so in order to distinguish an intersection case, there must be a labor component. Again, involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. It could be at the home of a trafficker or at an abuser's business, or the trafficker may benefit from the proceeds. So it could be, for example, if they're a farm worker and they're being trafficked, the abuser or trafficker may be keeping all of the income that they're getting. They're controlling, when they come home, how they're transported to their work site. It could be, again, gaining from prostitution. It can also be, for example, an intimate partner selling a child of their partner. They may share this child, but it could be, a form of control and abuse to do so. And of course, that would be considered, a commercially sexually exploited child. There must also be some form of force, fraud, or coercion to be considered human trafficking in an intimate partner case.
And can I jump in really quick, Ermelinda?
Yes.
I just want to add really, and I'm sure Sharon, I'm maybe stealing a little bit of your history when we talk about in this county, how we really started focusing on human trafficking was through the domestic violence service providers. We began seeing individuals accessing those services, but there was something else that was going on, and being able to really understand the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and seeing the definition of human trafficking and realizing, right, that it was occurring in our own community, and what could we do to support. these survivors, because it wasn't just right. It wasn't just those domestic violence services or intimate partner abuse services that they were seeking. Since they were also a trafficking survivor, there were so many other rights that they had access to, that it was so important, especially with our foreign born survivors, to ensure that if they want to be connected for different types of remedies and relief, that they're able to access those. So just throwing that in there is a little bit of our history lesson, with this is where it all started, was this intersection.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, so then we also see an intersection with
Actually,
sexual. Mhm.
I'm sorry. There's a question in the chat that I think is relevant. Ayana asks, what percentage of intimate partner violence do you see in the intersection of human trafficking in San Quentin? Do you have local thoughts on that?
Kim.
I think Kim's looking it up probably with.
We'll get back to you on that question. Maybe we can pop it in at the end or something. Or you
Can
got
I
it, Kim?
say, yes, it's a very timely question as we're looking at the last fiscal year of data and who all has been served. And so what we have seen, and this really reflects kind of the national percentages as well, is 15% of the survivors that we're working with have also report also having experienced intimate partner abuse. And that's about on par with other national screening tools that are being used, where they're seeing about that same percentage as well. So that's a great question, though.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kim. Okay, so we also see intersections with sexual assault. And so, of course, right, sex trafficking and sexual assault. So intersection cases of human trafficking and sexual assault occur when a trafficker benefits from an assault or abuse of a person, an individual, or many individuals, but it's generally it is a monetary benefit, but can include in-kind benefits. So it could be, receiving food, drugs, in exchange for the trafficked, the person who's being trafficked. It doesn't just have to be adults, or it's not just only adults. Guardians or parents can also be traffickers who take money from others who rape or sexually abuse minors. It can also be, it can also include gaining, like selling somebody for pornography, or it could also be selling the pornography.
And I always enjoy story time. I'm sorry. Or Melinda, I just keep jumping in.
That's okay, Kim.
But I know for me, when I first
Mhm.
started looking at intersections, sometimes it was like, well, like the intersection with sexual assault sometimes was hard for me to tease out or to identify. And so I know that there was a youth that I worked with that they had experienced sexual exploitation as a teenager. But then when they spoke about their childhood as well, their parent had an addiction, and the way that the parent was able to pay for that addiction was through being able to leave this young person, and the young person was molested by multiple different individuals, buyers that would come in, and that was the trade-off. So it can also, right? It can be that parent guardian, like Ermelinda was saying, that is acting as the trafficker and seeing all the benefits from the sale of their child.
Yes. And so in the housing context too, you'll see a parent or guardian doing this in exchange for, getting the rent paid, for example. But okay, so thank you, Kim. So on to the identification of human trafficking with disclosures. So there are within our agency and the point person agency referral system, which we'll talk more about, I think in the next presentation for tomorrow, but we may come across a survivor because we see that there are intersections, right? They may be domestic violence or sexual assault survivor who's identified through that same agency. It might be somebody who's walking in to an agency, to a domestic violence or sexual assault agency that may be coming in for domestic violence services, but that we may also see is a human trafficking survivor. We do have in-person responses to the police department, or sometimes we do have, some special circumstances where we are called by the police department to go onto the scene where where there are human trafficking survivors identified. And so we may come across a survivor that way. We also have gotten referrals from other organizations, such as through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, through Polaris, through the DFCS, and other local nonprofit organizations. I know we've also we've had great partnerships with other agencies who, again, identified or potentially identified somebody who may benefit from human trafficking services that we'll call our crisis line, which is, the other component. That our domestic violence, sexual assault organizations do have 24-hour crisis lines available to do warm handoffs with a survivor. We are available for consults over the crisis line, preferably through Kim. But there are also, you can also connect a survivor directly to an advocate at these domestic violence, sexual assault crisis lines, which, it is open 24 hours. It's really encouraged because you'll have access to an advocate then and there for somebody to speak to somebody about the services available. And so that's how we will do that. And so we do have a victim needs screening tool at our agencies. So the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking spent 2 years developing this tool to screen. Well, the purpose of the tool is not to establish, it's to screen for domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault. It's not to establish that an individual is or has been a victim of these crimes, but it's to identify that they may be or may have been survivors of the crimes, and therefore they can get connected to a confidential advocate or an attorney that can provide a more thorough assessment for the survivor. And so additionally, this screening tool that we use at our agencies, Aki Community Solutions, YWCA, can only be completed with clients that are over the age of 18. And it's, we use it to connect survivors to other services that they may be in need of. not just, some of the organizations don't have the capacity to serve human trafficking survivors, or, I mean, not these two, but for example, sexual assault. So we might have to do, the warm handoffs, or if there are other legal legal resources that we can point the clients to, this is a great tool for that. And some of you may have heard of the more condensed version of this victim needs screening tool. If you do perform VI SPDATs at your organizations, you are also able to do a more condensed version with the training. And so at your organizations, if you do have VI SPDATs, you're able to do it and then potentially screen for somebody and do a warm handoff that way. And so at the VI SPDAT trainings for the county, that is included as part of the training. So, okay.
So I'm going to jump in. Originally, we were going to have Alessandra de Romano speak today. I highly encourage you to come back tomorrow to hear her speak about her story, which is she's an amazing speaker, and we had a last minute change. So definitely come back tomorrow. Instead, today I'm going to provide an overview of a survivor story that's very present right now. You can see the LA Times article link, which you won't be able to click on from the screen, but Ermelinda is going to put that in the chat so that you can take some time to read through it later. I highly encourage you to do so. Allison's story is really pulls on all the intersections that we're talking about. This is an individual that abuses that have happened throughout childhood, throughout adolescence, they were all missed. And not only were they missed, but she was criminalized often for victimization that happened throughout her life. And it's culminated into what the LA Times story article is talking about, which is she's currently being prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Northern California District. She's being charged with conspiracy to commit trafficking. As you read through her testimony, and I will say the article is very raw, so definitely keep that in mind. If it may be triggering to read about, there's childhood sexual abuse, intrafamilial abuse, there's numerous forms of neglect, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. And so this individual is somebody that we are actively advocating for. And so just read through that story. It'll be a good, it's really what we're talking about today, because this is an individual who really not only is fighting for, her freedom in terms of the system, but even thinking through of, even if she gets probation, her thought is, well, I can't access housing. How can I take care of my kids? I won't be able to go to school and get student loans. So thinking about her future as well. And it really brings into perspective a lot of what we're talking about in these 2 days. So I'm going to be really taking a deeper dive into what we're talking about with criminalization of survivors. Again, I'm the director of the coalition. I am an attorney by trade, and my background really has been in crime research and criminology. But when we're talking about criminalization, we're talking about criminalization that happens in the system, but it also happens in various ways through our society. Usually, we think of law enforcement and they criminalize people formally with the criminal justice system, but criminalization can even be seen when we talk about immigration, how to, the language that we use. Are we really treating somebody differently based on their circumstances? So we see criminalization reflected obviously in our laws, but think about society. So a good example would be in San Jose. We have an area that is known for having a high prevalence of street level commercial sex, and law enforcement effectuates what's called prostitution abatement. Basically, they try to arrest anyone who appears to be selling commercial sex. But what's really important is that law enforcement has responded to community members. So what we saw a few years ago is that area, there's a elementary school, there's a library, and there's a lot of families. And so these families were going to city hall and saying, somebody needs to come clean this up. So they too were engaged in the criminalization process. They were advocating for people to be arrested. We tried to come in and kind of provide education and even do focus groups of who do you think the individuals are that you're seeing out there? What do you think their circumstances are? And also bringing out the issue of who else do you think is involved? You know, when we talk about criminalization, a lot of it is who are we focusing on? Are we focusing on all kind of parties that have some culpability? Are we just focusing on one piece or another? And so a lot of what we talk about then is, and I'll do a deeper dive into this, it's really about our perceptions. There's a lot of perceptions that impact criminalization. Let me change my own slide. Okay. So in terms of laws, legislation, and law enforcement, I like to use this slide because we work a lot with law enforcement. We really try to be very proactive with partnership. There are a lot of failures that are in the system. We'll get into those too. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. But I also think there are pretty serious gaps that make it really difficult sometimes for us to really have a completely survivor-informed approach. We have our federal definition of trafficking. That's what Melinda really was breaking down in the beginning, where you have the force, fraud, and coercion that comes from the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. That was kind of the first piece of legislation throughout the US that focused on trafficking over 20 years ago. California adopted its own version at the state level. We see that in our California Penal Code 236.1. You may remember Prop 35 really helped shift California's focus specifically on trafficking. It's really important that you know that the state definition is different from the federal definition. Namely, the penal code requires a showing of deprivation of liberty. That's really important because it's actually harder to show in many ways. Deprivation of liberty means that somebody cannot leave for some reason. So it's kind of a higher threshold for a prosecutor to prove that somebody, why didn't they leave? Particularly if we're talking about adults. So it creates a challenge sometimes in prosecution. But what's really important is even if law enforcement doesn't recognize that, a survivor of trafficking might still be eligible for various benefits. And we're going to talk more about that in the next few days. But I just want you to know it's really important that these laws may impact how services are offered and what justice might look like. And certainly justice should definitely be in the hands of the survivor. But I just want to flag that. Safe harbor laws are kind of a general term, what we see around the US up until, I always say 5 years ago for everything, but I think this is actually about 5 years ago. Up until about 5 years ago, California, you were allowed to arrest a minor for prostitution, which is really interesting because if that minor didn't get paid money, it'd be statutory rape. But when they get paid money, they were actually being criminalized for prostitution. So it's one of kind of the larger reforms that we're seeing around the US, saying that we should be, you may have seen the campaign actually, and you'll see a slide with the logo for it of no such thing as a child prostitute. Is again, part of it is a culture shift, a society culture shift, how we use language. Part of it is realizing how can we expect to be helping survivors when our laws contradict that? How can we be saying two things at once and holding minors who are being exploited to a different standard? And safe harbor laws helps us move to a presumption that they are victims. I will say for law enforcement, sometimes there's a paternalistic argument that now with safe harbor laws, they no longer have the jurisdiction to kind of hold a survivor. Sometimes they felt, at least if I could arrest them, I knew that they were safe, you know, going to juvenile hall. Advocates, of course, we're going to say that that's not survivor-centered, survivor-informed. So it really requires, again, then a shift in how we approach the issue. when survivors are not being criminalized, and how do we engage? How do we improve access? And how are we providing exit opportunities out of exploitation? For law enforcement's view, then, we still have prostitution laws on the books, and we have human trafficking laws on the books. It's a little bit more clear when you have a minor. There's a presumption now they're survivor trafficking. But once somebody hits 18, we know those power dynamics are still there. But for law enforcement, they kind of are stuck in the situation of, is this person a sex worker or is this person a victim? And how much time and how much training do they have to actually delve deeper into that? And what we see is that, we still have a long way to go in terms of moving away from that dichotomy. I put together kind of a slide of a lot of different cases. There's a logo I told you about, no such thing as a child prostitute. Many people are familiar with Cyntoia Brown. That case got a lot of national coverage. She was an individual who at 16 years old was sentenced to 51 years for shooting her rapist. Somebody bought her for, and did I freeze for a second? Froze on my side. Okay. Rewind, do it again. Cyntoia Brown, she was sentenced to 51 years for killing her rapist, who was a sex buyer. She was granted clemency after a large national campaign. Sarah Cruzon, she's from California. At the age of 16, she killed her abuser, her trafficker. She was prosecuted for first-degree murder, and she received life without the possibility of parole. It's pretty crazy to think about. She was incarcerated for a long time. Just this year, though, she was fully pardoned by the governor. But you have to think about what kind of impact that's had on her life since then. She has been a big proponent of trying to get federal legislation passed. So Sarah's Law, it allows judges discretion in the federal system to depart from their mandatory minimum guidelines, specifically as it relates to minors who commit violent crimes against their abusers. Again, it's interesting to think that it took up until now for that law to pass. A really current case, well, I mentioned Allison's case, and I really do hope you'll read about her case, but Crystal Kaiser is another one. The Washington Post did a really great article on Crystal Kaiser. You even get to see snippets of the interview. And I think that's really enlightening because, again, it really gives you a sense of some of the intersections we're going to talk about today. When investigators treat a child, she's 17 years old, charged as an adult in the death of a man who filmed sexual abuse of her as well as other girls, primarily all girls of color. She's been fighting to even include her trafficking as an affirmative as a defense in her case. So the Supreme Court in Wisconsin has says you can use that as a defense. But that's where we are currently, where we're still, a lot of states haven't caught up culturally to really aligning with, I think, what we can all agree is we should not be criminalizing survivors of forms of gender-based violence. And all of these individuals, as you delve deeper, you'll see strong intersections to what we've already spoken about: intimate partner violence, childhood neglect and abuse. So
Sharon, there's a question in the chat if you want to quickly.
Oh yeah.
Sorry about that.
The question about I'm actually going to get to that, the disproportionate impact on individuals of color. So I'll have a slide on that specifically, and we'll address that in just a little bit, if that's okay. It'll be better with the visual. Get back to, okay. Here's another grouping of survivors. So here's a great quote, not great quote, it's a really dark quote, but it gives you an idea of at least 290 minors were arrested for prostitution-related offense in 2019. And that's the most recent year that national data is available. 40 were 14 or younger. So these are children. Many of those are in Nevada, which, as we know, Nevada is one of the few states where we actually see commercialized sex legal. So we're not going to get into that bigger question, but I would just, put there that legalization in and of itself is not a solution. And just seeing this, I think, is really clear where you have a number of minors who are being exploited. It also brings up this, so I'll tell you a little bit about Jessica and Jordan Hampton. They are siblings. They are currently charged as adults. Well, Jessica is 18, but Jordan is 15 years older, and he's being charged as an adult. They were trafficked actually by a 24-year-old. And it was related to robbery of a buyer, which resulted in the death of that individual. And so you can see that they're both facing, Jessica can actually be facing the death penalty, which is really, really crazy to think about. So these are all cases. I think change.org, Washington Post, like I said, has put together a really good overview. A lot of survivors that we're seeing being criminalized. I'd really encourage you to add your name to change.org petitions for these survivors and see if you can use your voice to assist. But it brings up with this bigger question for a lot of survivors of the idea of perfect victims, that somehow we expect individuals who are suffering severe and complex trauma to behave in a certain way. And despite the fact that many of us have not gone through the circumstances that some of them have gone through. Certainly when you read Allison's case, creating expectations of how she should behave is something that we really need to take a step back from. And maybe you do. So maybe I shouldn't be saying we. I'm just talking about the general we, the big picture we. Okay. So what are other, so perceptions are really important too. Why are some individuals seen as survivors and others criminals? Certainly I talked about the imperfect victim. And we'll talk a little bit more about when survivors sometimes do engage in criminal acts in context of their victimization. But one of the big things is because we're relying on disclosures. So again, I talk about that dichotomy. So if law enforcement is engaged, speaking to somebody who they believe is selling sex, you know, they're relying on that individual to disclose. And what we know for a lot of survivors is that disclosure is not that simple, particularly for human trafficking. Often identifying as a victim is a huge vulnerability. So part of the survival techniques they use includes, you know, self-empowerment in that space. So you'll find, I know many survivors who will say that they would have never identified as a victim or a survivor until years outside of being in the life, you know. So that's a huge problem when we're relying on those disclosures, particularly if there hasn't been a lot of time put into providing access to support, ways to cultivate trust or rapport building. A number of individuals with complex trauma have no reason to believe that somebody is going to actually help them, especially if they've been failed by numerous systems in their past. Are folks familiar with the term of adultification? This is a really intersectional term as well. It's typically, it really disproportionately impacts Black girls when we expect a child to behave as an adult in certain circumstances. The survivor I mentioned, Crystal Kaiser, if you watch her interview, you very much will see investigators being guilty of adultification, where they expect this child to be an adult. Oh, well, I have a 15-year-old, but she doesn't dress like that. Or, you know, you should see how she's walking along the street. She's acting like an adult. She knows what she's doing. It could be even in language that we hear again throughout gender-based violence, where somehow abusers will say that a child is being provocative, or when juries are, you know, thinking about how somebody dresses as a reason for the assault. So there's a lot of intersections there. That also intersects with the gender bias that we see. Gender bias can also be intersectional. So we often hear, especially with relation to gender-based violence, you know, how did the woman react with law enforcement? Was she hysterical? You know, she wasn't making sense. She was acting crazy. We see this intersectionally with racialized stereotypes. hot-headed Latina, or somebody being dramatic, aggressive Black women. Very often we do hear from typically law enforcement that are survivors acting hostile. And often it's with regards to women of color. So I'll speak about this later, but I will say that we do see disproportionate trafficking of women of color, Indigenous girls, as well as Black girls, disproportionate impact with members of the LGBTQ+ community. So keep that in mind. And so that also relates to perceptions when we talk about how they engage with law enforcement. So if individuals come from communities that already have been criminalized generally by law enforcement or society, they may have previous histories that previous interactions with law enforcement that are really negative. Law enforcement may be coming to them also with those negative perceptions. And so how they interact with that individual, they may not see them as a victim. Society ourselves, we marginalize members of society often. I mentioned immigration. That's a huge one. When we are doing training on labor trafficking, immigration comes up a lot, and it's interesting to think about because somehow folks think that somebody being exploited is okay based on their immigration status. So that's, we're not seeing that individual as part of the community. And so that plays a huge piece in how our perceptions and our response to trafficking happens. I don't know if, Perla, did you want to add anything to that? I was looking at you nodding, so I just want to make sure.
I'm just validating what you're saying.
Oh, good. Cool. Okay. So what we try to move, so this is all about setting the stage for how we kind of currently think about issues related to this. And again, I'm saying the larger we, as in society, certainly not you, but we try to focus on commonalities. So particularly with sex trafficking, we don't really need to figure out if an individual we're working with is a sex worker or a survivor of trafficking. I mean, certainly it helps with regards to services, but you can focus on the commonalities, right? We know that for many survivors of trafficking, it depends on where they are in their journey. Again, when you hear from Elle, that'll certainly be the case where, and this is very often, is you find individuals who may be trafficked into the life, and then they may not have their trafficker for a certain period of time. They may be engaging in sex for survival. Maybe they're engaging in sex for money to provide for basic needs. Which is also sex for survival, but they may be also actually just a sex worker. It could also be intersections with if they are using substances and to pay for that. And so they may identify at different points in different ways. But regardless, we know that that individual, often they come with histories of being marginalized. We look at the various intersections here. They often have a number of vulnerabilities. Poverty, they may have been involved in the criminal justice system already, which is a vulnerability, or the foster care system, experiences with gender-based violence, which I think we've really spoken a lot about today. And regardless of how they identify, there are far higher rates of violence within the sex trade. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So again, we're trying to move away from dichotomies when we're talking about trafficking and sex work. So this is just to highlight again that when we're trying to decide who if somebody's a sex worker or if they're trafficked, we're still relying upon disclosures. And so again, that's why we move away from that and focus on services instead. Regardless of how that person identifies, how can we provide access for them to reduce harm and live a healthy life? The other thing that we talk about is trying to paint a picture of who's in the sex trade, because I think that's really important when we're trying to paint this picture of how many people are actually being trafficked, how many people have agency. When we say sex worker, I'm talking about an individual who has agency. They have the ability to choose who their buyers are. They have the ability to choose safety options when engaging in sex. And so I'll share kind of a research-based pyramid in a second. But it's also, these gray areas make it really difficult often to parse out where somebody sits in that spectrum of being somebody with full agency or if they're trafficked. So Melissa Farley is a researcher, and we adapted this slightly, and I'll tell you how, but it gives you a picture. This is pulled together from a variety of research sources that look at exploitation and sex work around the world, so not just to the US. And in general, what you're finding is that sex workers with full agency, so individuals who again have that choice, are about 2%. Individuals who really fit within that definition of trafficking, so CSEX stands for commercial sexual exploitation of children, so minors who are being sexually exploited, or adults who are being exploited through force, fraud, or coercion, that accounts for 60%. So, you know, over 50% of individuals who we see selling sex definitely qualify as trafficking survivors. And then the next biggest chunk is those individuals who are in that gray area. So exchanging sex for survival. They may not have traffickers. They may be exchanging sex for substances that they're using. Another big one we see, especially in transgender community, they may be exchanging sex to be able to pay for hormone treatments, or other individuals may be exchanging sex to pay for medicine, medical care. Certainly in the Bay Area, we see a lot of individuals who are selling sex to pay the rent. So it's not, so I mean, feel free to put in the comments. I'm interested always to hear if folks do feel like this pyramid is representative. But regardless, knowing that 40% kind of is in that gray area means it's really important to not focus on an either or dichotomy. This came out a little smaller. Sorry if the text is small. It's, Dr. Kim Chang, who is in Oakland, Asian Health Services. She's really a pioneer at looking at healthcare and trafficking, put together this slide that really looks at some of the health risks that trafficking survivors face with regards to medical health risks, mental health, social. And you can see medical, there's STIs, unintended pregnancies, violence, actual trauma, lack of primary care or malnutrition. Oral health is a really big one. A number of survivors haven't seen a dentist in a long time. And of course, adverse childhood events, or ACE. ACE scores you see are pretty high with survivors of trafficking. There are long-term impact medically, but there's also long-term impact in terms of mental health, depression, PTSD, anxiety or panic, dissociation. I think that's also really important when we're training law enforcement. The dissociation sometimes is what law enforcement reads as being unemotional or uncaring, and I think that's a really important training point. Individuals may be using substance use to cope with the trauma, or it could have been that the trafficker was using substances as a means of control and coercion, which we'll talk about a little later as well. And then social, that's where we see the criminalization coming in as a health-related risk for survivors, lack of formal education, economic opportunity. I put some stats on the side too, because when we talk about violence, certainly for trafficking survivors, violence is embedded in the acts themselves. Each form of it's rape. So there's that, but on top of that, even as individuals identify as sex workers, you'll see that for sex work in general, they have much higher homicide rates than the general public, 17 times higher based on some studies. Mortality rate can be 200 times higher than the general public. And rates of violence, depending on the study, are 40 to 90% higher than the general public. So those are significant health risks, which is another reason why I think a lot of advocates are moving towards a really health-based approach to combating human trafficking. Again, it moves us away from the dichotomy. And if we focus on reducing harm, that's a better longer-term and consistent strategy that doesn't harm survivors or criminalize. So I showed you that pyramid in part because it's really good to contrast it to how we're actually seeing people being arrested related to commercial sex acts. So, you know, I mentioned human trafficking is a crime on the books. Pimping and pandering are still crimes on the books. And as is prostitution and solicitation. This year, loitering with intent was removed as a means for arrest, but prior to this information is prior to that bill passing. You can see the vast majority of arrests. This is for the city of San Jose. Oh, I'm sorry, the little marker for city of San Jose is too light. But you can see the vast majority of arrests are for individuals who are presumably selling sex. Even though in that pyramid, we saw 60% should be identified as potential survivors. Another 40% are individuals who really should be offered services. And, you know, if law enforcement is enforcing against prostitution and solicitation, that really should just be 2%. But we're seeing only, you know, just a handful of cases actually against traffickers. Vast majority is survivors or individuals who are selling sex are disproportionately being held accountable for prostitution or loitering. And so now we'll talk about intersections with criminalization, and Kim will jump in as well. But I've been trying to weave it in all throughout, you know, when we talk about intersections with race, gender, sexual identity. But there are different intersections when we talk about trafficking and different trends that we see. Survivors engaging in criminal acts, and actually how the criminal justice system operates, as well as different vulnerabilities. Do you want to add anything to this slide, Kim? Or should I just?
No, I don't want to add anything. Thank you, though.
Okay, we're gonna move along. Cool. What we do see is within the criminal justice system, and I think individuals who work in domestic violence have seen this for a while, is that it kind of relates to that power dynamic. Often the person who's been the abuser, they may actually use a criminal justice system as a means to control that individual. I already mentioned that we still have laws on the books that kind of presumptively criminalize survivors, and law enforcement's heavily relied on those because it's often easier. It's an easier investigation. So it's a lot easier to arrest a seller of sex than it is to arrest a buyer or a trafficker. The amount of investigation that needs to happen is significantly more. For buyers, you know, it requires them to do specific kind of operations where they typically have to use female officers, which are still a minority. So, so you still see that law enforcement is kind of using old strategies to disproportionately criminalize sellers of sex, who tend to be women, often women of color. Another intersection is defending against criminal charges can be complicated. It comes back to that disclosure. You may have survivors who the red flags are there, but they still don't identify as someone who's being trafficked. The advocates will break this down a little further later, but often survivors, you know, their relationship to their trafficker really can mimic domestic violence. So they have a strong loyalty to their trafficker. And so that can make it more difficult in terms of criminal justice process. And often with trafficking, if there's, you know, there may be overt violence, but there may be threats or coercion. And those are things that are really hard to see or identify. And so, especially for foreign-born individuals, you hear often that traffickers have connections to their family back home, and we won't see those threats. We don't know the control that those threats have on that individual. So I can give you an example for that. In San Francisco, there has been a trend of individuals specifically from Honduras who are engaged in drug trafficking, but there are strong indications that the individuals who are actually selling the drugs are being trafficked. They are, by and large, being the ones who are criminalized for that act. And part of it is because the individuals who are likely being trafficked are gravely afraid of the violence happening to their family back home, and so they are not even though we have an affirmative defense in California, with regards to trafficking, they're not seeking the use of that affirmative defense because they want to preserve the safety of their family back home. Yeah.
Yes. And so it's really being able to take a look at that, the criminalization of those acts of survival. And so many of the survivors that we have worked with have this intersection or are going through various cases. For example, we've worked with individuals that have experienced trafficking that are also going through or that are facing charges that are related to substance use, and really being able to see that act, right? There's something else, right? Being able to take a moment to say, okay, yeah, like there's laws, there's all of these things, but what else is going on? What has happened to this individual that these behaviors, these things that are happening, that they're there? Because many of these, right, it's just a way to be able to survive and stay safe. I also want to point out that one of the common trends that we have seen when we're talking about criminalization acts of survival is also, right, robbery or grand theft auto. Those are two that have really even among minors that we have seen as an ongoing trend, where it is a way to be able to have those funds, right? Because there's a trafficker, there is that individual that is saying, hey, you need to bring in the money. This is what I expect. And that is a way for them to be able to do that, that is safer for themselves.
And can I add in here just a side note? As you read through Allison's story, there is an intersection there with gang involvement. And so we can certainly see that Allison's trafficker is a gang member. And so I think the assumption on the U.S. Attorney's by the U.S. Attorney's Office is that the women being exploited were all gang members as well. And so you can certainly see how that lends to her criminalization as well. Okay, go back to the slide. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So this comes back to the question where we do see disproportionate incarceration in general. So I've already mentioned that with regards to trafficking, we see disproportionate representation of individuals of color being trafficked, but also separately, when we just look at incarceration rates, we know that Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at almost 5 times the rate of white Americans. Latinos are also disproportionately incarcerated. There's also studies that show it's not just at one point of the system, but as you look at each point in the system, there's disproportionate impact. So we're talking about from arrest, we do see disproportionate impact, from charging, from representation. So the kind of attorneys that are how those attorneys are representing them, all the way through to conviction and then sentencing. And it is really important to think about each step of the way, because again, there's a lot of failures with the front part of the system when we're talking about law enforcement, but there's also a lot of failures when we're talking about judges and juries. And when we're talking about juries, it's really on, defense as well as prosecution to educate juries. Our sentencing guidelines have a big impact there as well. So we see that disproportion throughout the system. And here people call and LGBTQ plus individuals 3 times more likely to be incarcerated for individuals who do not identify. 1 in 2 Black transgender people have been to prison. We'll have some more statistics that look at this later as well, but this is just to kind of set the stage. Where did Kim's face go?
I think Kim had to step away.
Oh, okay. Well,
You
then
need-
I'm jumping on this. Did you want to do it? You want me to do it? I'll do it.
Go for it.
Okay, so here we're bringing in the intersection then of survivors in the criminal justice system who, again, that intersection with domestic violence. So 79% of women in federal and state prisons reported histories of physical abuse, and over 60% reported past sexual abuse. 39% of people identified as women in juvenile systems have been sexually abused or raped, and 56% experienced DV. I definitely want you to think about these statistics when we hear from Elle tomorrow. A lot of these situations and these stats certainly applied to her experience. About 18% of men in state prisons report having been sexually or otherwise physically abused, and up to 91% of trafficking survivors report having been arrested. So it really highlights, again, all of those intersections.
Can I also share with folks, if folks are interested, there's the Battered Women's Justice Project, and it's a project that's put in place to provide support through the appeals process for survivors of domestic violence that killed their abusers in self-defense and now were convicted without the proper support. So that definitely is something that we see very often.
You know, Pearlie, you jumped in after we did introductions. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Berta Flores with Community Solutions, also the chair of the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And thank you all for being here today.
So this looks at age groups. So another another intersection that's really important is transitional age youth. So youth that are 18 to 24 years or 25 years old. That group is particularly important because, as many of you know, individual brain development continues to occur throughout adolescence up to the age of 25. So we know that a person is still developing up to the age of 25, and yet at the age of 18, they're really being treated as an adult. So our expectations, their liabilities, really attach at the age of 18. Research will also tell you that individuals who've suffered various forms of complex trauma, that impacts development as well. Again, when you read through Allison's story, I asked you to consider and think through how her situation had impacted her development and decision-making abilities as well, her ability to respond to situations of high stress. We know that individuals who have suffered complex trauma, repeated trauma, that the actual cortisol that a body secretes in the brain will impact brain development as well. And so all of that to say is that, again, when we look at our arrest numbers, and this is again for loitering, arrest for loitering for prostitution, it's that same kind of chart I showed you before. When we're looking at individuals who are being arrested for selling sex, the vast majority are those transitional age youth. So these are also individuals who, if they've been in foster care, they're losing access often to different services and supports. And so many of these individuals are engaging in sex for survival. There's a great study by Covenant House that also really does an in-depth dive about how many young people are actually exchanging sex for basic needs like food and shelter. And here is a deeper dive. And again, the time period is January 2015 to September 2019. This is from City of San Jose, who actually is our strongest law enforcement partner, and provided this data so that I could criticize them. So I think that, you know, at least speaks to a level of transparency that is getting us one step forward, which is really important. So you'll see, again, commercial sex related arrests by race and ethnicity. That's the colored charts, and comparing it then to the actual population demographics in our county. You see vast disproportionate impact on African Americans, who are less than 3% in our county, but almost 60% of arrests for that time period. We see Asian gets broken down as well. There's disproportionate impact there. So this really highlights what we kind of know as general trends, and we're seeing it now very much localized. I was trying to move our faces around so I could read it a little bit better, but yeah. And Perla, did you want to cover this slide? I can as well.
Yeah, I don't have myself down for it, but if you want to do it, I can jump in if you need me to.
I'll jump in. So this really relates to the actual trauma of incarceration itself. So far, we've been talking about a lot of individuals who may have had histories of different forms of trauma, different histories of gender-based violence, but there's a lot of violence that happens within the criminal justice system itself. You may have heard a lot of attention being paid to solitary confinement, which, in international law has been identified as a form of torture. And it's something that's heavily relied upon still in many of our prisons throughout the US. That form of isolation can be damaging. It can impact, again, brain operation on top of mental health. So people who've been released after being in solitary confinement for years, they don't recover. They do not recover. They have, it can impact their speech and the communication. Obviously, there's heightened vulnerability. So there's a lot of violence that happens within the criminal justice system. Stop Prison Rape is an organization that focuses specifically on sexual violence. Forms of control. We know that correctional officers have a lot of discretion on the ways that they control populations, to the point where there's a lot of evidence to support that there's abuses within that. And people are under constant threat of violence. So that again is ongoing trauma.
And I also put in the chat information about PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And obviously, a few years ago, there's an acknowledgement that sexual assault and rape within the prison system is a significant issue. So there's a link there if you want to learn more about PREA.
And some really stark statistics about the rates of sexual assault while incarcerated. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted while incarcerated. Upwards of 67% of incarcerated LGBTQ plus individuals have been sexually assaulted. Again, if you've been paying attention to news, there's been a pretty high profile case of a transgender individual who was inappropriately placed in a male prison, and there's high safety concerns there. The impact of criminalization there's long impact. There's obviously the stigma. So we know that criminal records can impact an individual in all sorts of ways, from housing to job opportunities, voting restrictions in many states. When somebody is criminalized, particularly when you talk about sex trafficking, where somebody is engaging in commercial sex, and there may be a financial component where either if they're doing sex for survival, so they're doing it for monetary reasons, or in sex trafficking, they usually have a certain amount of money that they are required to provide to the trafficker. When they get arrested, there's restitution, there's costs associated with it. So it actually becomes a disincentive for them to then leave the life, because they now have to pay back more money, or they may owe their trafficker more money. Obviously, I mentioned the employment. It also, again, the impact is they don't trust authority figures, particularly if, there are other, especially in the context of the larger context that we were speaking about before, their previous engagement with law enforcement has been negative, but the criminalization itself also has a big impact, system impact. So what we're seeing now is that a lot of survivors, we have laws that allow, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but allow them to vacate or expunge their criminal record. And so now this is something that makes inefficiencies in our system. We shouldn't have charged those individuals in the first place. It weakens credibility in our system as well. Often we say we really need a consistent approach. If you have one police department who's arresting individuals selling sex and another that is saying we're here to help them, it kind of cancels each other out. If we're saying that we really believe in public safety and yet we're prosecuting survivors, what does that actually say about creating a safe community? It impacts our arguments about decriminalization or legalization. And it also brings in the bigger question of like, who are we really holding accountable? Because in most of those numbers, very few are actual sex buyers or traffickers. So the vast majority, when we're looking at commercial sex specifically, we really are holding individuals who sell sex predominantly responsible for trafficking and prostitution or commercial sex. So does that really then have any kind of deterrent effect? Oh, lucky you guys. We're finally due for a break. Hopefully it hasn't been too much for you. Feel free to, let's see, what time are we at? 3:28. It's a 5-minute break. Okay, let me see our faces. How tired is everyone? Are there faces? There are a lot of faces. Thanks for keeping your cameras on, folks. Oh yeah. So let's say we can go till actually, so 3:35. Does that sound good? So that's 7 minutes. Very generous. You might be able to get in a meal as well as, you know, other things. So, okay. See you back in 7 minutes, folks. And we're back. I'm going to share my screen again. Give me 1 second. And in that time, I believe Perla is going to take us away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming back. It's a lot of information, so I really appreciate all of you being here. And of course, whatever you need to do to address self-care needs, feel free to do that. And we're going to spend some time now talking about vulnerabilities and trauma. And if we can go to the next slide. Oh, you want to wait a second? Sure.
It's just loading kind of slowly. So let me just move our faces again. This happened earlier, a little bit slow. Come on, dude, go. No, it's still not going. All right, well, still want to load the try the slideshow here. All right, cool.
Guess we're taking another break.
Here we go.
Oh, do you mind going to the previous slide? So again, the purpose of this section is to explore how some of the underlying vulnerabilities that survivors have can exacerbate the exploitation they're going through, and also how they become, those vulnerabilities become barriers for survivors trying to leave an exploitative or abusive situation. Thank you, Cher. I'm not sure if Ermelinda got, I hope this is not repetitive, but one of the reasons that the community solutions and some of the domestic violence, sexual assault service providers extended services to human trafficking survivors back in 2003 is that we realized that there's a lot of similarities between human trafficking and domestic violence, and in some cases, sexual assault. So we know that abusers will use similar tactics to first exert power and control over their victims, and then to maintain that power and control. And so it's really important that when we're supporting survivors, that we understand those different power and control tactics and how they can impact individuals that already have risk factors or vulnerabilities, and including poverty. One of the things that we've seen very frequently is individuals that are in trafficking situations, even in domestic violence situations, that are not able to leave because of that financial reliance on their trafficker. Homelessness is a significant issue, and there's tons of reports that have come out of the prevalence of gender-based violence and how that contributes to homelessness. And then also for youth that are runaway youth, young adults are also at high risk for exploitation. Individuals that are not documented, that's definitely a vulnerability. It's something that that makes individuals more at risk for exploitation. And then again, also becomes a barrier when they're trying to leave that situation. Prior trauma and abuse, we definitely is a risk factor, a vulnerability. Unemployment, individuals that are part of the LGBTQ community have at times higher vulnerabilities in terms of exploitation. And we've also had worked with survivors that have cognitive or physical disabilities, and that puts them at greater risk for exploitation. Lack of support, support networks and isolation can really make somebody more vulnerable to being exploited. And then limited English proficiency or literacy, the relationship they have with the trafficker. I think we've talked quite a bit about how in many of the situations of where someone's being trafficked, the trafficker is also someone the victim's having a relationship with. I'll give you an example. One of the first sex trafficking survivors that I worked with at our shelter years ago basically shared with me how this person that she was seeing started a relationship with her and started asking her, if, we'll call her Cindy, if she would help him pay some of the bills, and that she could do that by going on these dates. And it turned into a situation where he became really physically and emotionally abusive when Cindy didn't want to do that anymore. And for her, it's again, because you have the intimate partner violence, so you have those dynamics, and you have the dynamics of the trafficking that's happening, and then also the dynamics of the sexual assaults that Cindy was suffering as well. So we think about all these risk factors or vulnerabilities that might make put somebody at higher risk for being exploited or trafficked. Add all of those risk factors, plus these additional barriers to seeking support, to really think about why would someone that's in an exploitative situation, an abusive situation, not be able to leave that situation and look for support. Again, in addition to all the risk factors that we discussed, there's fear due to threats of harm to self or loved ones. And we have seen that so frequently. And Sharon talked a little bit about, particularly when the family members are in a different country. There's also a lot of fear and mistrust of legal systems or law enforcement. Unfortunately, and particularly amongst the undocumented community members, that's a significant fear and barrier. There's lack of understanding of laws or resources. And then the shame, and particularly in cases of sex trafficking, we've talked to many survivors that the main reason that they state that they remained in that situation and didn't seek support if they could have was because of that shame. They didn't want their family members, they didn't want their friends or people back from their home country knowing that they'd been forced into sex work. Also, lack of knowledge about human trafficking. I think it's really important for, as advocates, as case managers, I try to identify, and we talked about the reason to have this intersectional approach and tease out whether somebody, in addition to being a domestic violence survivor, sexual assault survivor, is also a human trafficking survivor, and particularly that person's foreign born. And I know Jessica's going to talk more about the different immigration relief options that are available to survivors. And the other piece is the lack of control over their personal documents. A lot of the survivors that we work with, their trafficker controls all of their documents and their informations, and so there's that fear, if I leave, how am I going to ever get that back? You can go to the next slide.
Can I actually add in?
Sure.
Haven't heard it from me enough today, but you won't hear from me tomorrow. Just don't worry. But I wanted to add in that it's also really important to realize that these vulnerabilities here, they compound, right? So we know that individuals in the LGBTQ community face a lot of discrimination in the workplace, so it impacts employment. We know a lot of individuals who engage in sex work and are transgender will say that at least it's something they can do and actually be themselves. So that's really important because it brings in those larger, again, societal factors of how we're all playing a role again, the larger all, just knowing that these compound with each other. Another really great, really, I think, stark example is there was a quote in an Attorney General report of an individual who'd been raised in foster care, and is quoted as saying that they were raised in a system where an individual had to be paid to care for them. So how is being with a trafficker any different? So again, when we talk about those larger societal impacts. Okay.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Sharon. I think that's when we think about how these different issues impact each other. We worked with a survivor of sex trafficking recently, and this individual, she had started being exploited when she was about 15, 16. And by the time she was able to get support while she was a minor. As soon as she turned 18, a lot of that support went away. And so the survivor would share with us, she'd say, I have to take drugs because that helps me cope with doing sex work, which I have to do to have money to pay a room to sleep in. And so if she'd had access to housing, the other issues or the other, she wouldn't have to be in that situation of having to take drugs and perform sex work that she didn't want to do. We can go to the next slide. And then there's particular marginalized groups where there's vulnerabilities that we see. For example, 1 in 8 respondents to the U.S. transgender survey have participated in sex work for income. 50% of prostituted women reported histories of physical abuse, and even higher percentage of sexual abuse. And again, we see that intersection there. And 75% of clients did not recognize that they were being exploited and therefore did not seek help. And we see that really often with individuals, and whether it's domestic violence or labor trafficking, sex trafficking, it becomes normalized based on somebody's history of trauma, and the fact that whatever information the survivor has about the way that the world works is all being filtered through that trafficker. And go to the next slide, unless you want to add anything, Sharon. Okay. And again, to spend a little bit more time in vulnerabilities and marginalized groups, we have a quote here: street life puts youth in close proximity to potential abusers. For example, youth are propositioned to trade sex in exchange for meeting basic needs such as food and shelter. And as sexual assault service providers, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to youth that were running away from home or didn't have a place to sleep, and have the foster care system, or running away from abusive environments, and end up having to be in the situation where they're being exploited. And they'll meet some older gentleman. They'll say, well, you can stay in my house and I'll feed you, and you have to have sex with me. And that happens so often. And it's a good thing that there just need to be that showing of force, fraud, or coercion in terms of commercial sexual exploitation of minors. And we've talked about this quite a bit, and it's how African-American women are disproportionately represented among female victims of prostitution-related homicide, and are more likely to be controlled by an exploiter. And prostituted African-American women are more likely to be arrested, have higher fines, receive more jail time, and have their children removed by the child welfare system. And when we first started back in 2011, is when our county started looking at the issue of commercial sexual exploitation. It's really heartbreaking because the census showed that there's only 3% of individuals in Santa Clara County identify as Black or African American, and yet commercially sexually exploited children, and primarily young girls of Black or African American descent, represented about 40 to 50% of the youth that we were working with. And I don't know, Sharon, when you talk about the adultification, and particularly how that, do you want to share a little bit here about that?
Oh, we shared a little bit earlier just about adultification as well. But especially, and I think I mentioned earlier also that there's the intersection where Black girls are really, there's research to show that adultification impacts them, not just in criminal justice system, but in healthcare. in the education system, where we see, the school to prison pipeline. That certainly reflects a lot of disproportionate impact of communities of color, and particularly the Black community. I wanted to add one more thing, if you don't mind, because it relates to housing. Is so that first bullet point where we're talking about, young people exchanging sex for basic needs. We know very, very well that even in our county, traffickers and exploiters, they know where young people are sleeping. So even if they do have shelter options, they congregate. Sometimes they'll congregate near schools, and so it brings us back to like, what are safe housing options for individuals.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's also part of the reason that with through our work to expand support services and have better policies for youth that are at risk of or confirmed that have been commercially sexually exploited, congregate care in those situations is not a good option. And really, the best practice is to identify and to develop specialized foster care homes for commercially sexually exploited children or children at risk of commercial sexual exploitation. And again, the other piece that becomes a huge vulnerability is immigration status, and also that where folks that are coming into the U.S. Are at high risk of being sexually assaulted, of being abused through that migration period. So it's really important when supporting foreign-born survivors to ensure that we're addressing and trying to tease out and identify all the different types of trauma. And that's why an intersectional approach is very important. We've again worked with so many survivors of human trafficking that are foreign-born and undocumented, and that's creates so many barriers. It puts them at higher risk of being exploited. And it also creates so many barriers when they're trying to leave that situation. And particularly because we know that the majority of cases of human trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, the victim knows their abuser. And so there's some interesting dynamics that come into play with that. I'll share one example. Years ago, there was a case that was investigated by the FBI. I think HSI was involved as well, regarding traffickers that were trafficking fruit vendors through California. I think they were going also like into Oregon, Washington. And so long story short, the case was investigated. There was a huge operation. There 16 individuals were identified as potential human trafficking victims. And due to all those different vulnerabilities that we talked about, the fact that they knew the traffickers, only 3 of the 16 individuals that were identified trusted the service providers and legal providers enough to stay in the U.S. and avail themselves of the different benefits and immigration relief available to them. However, about 3 days after the traffickers were arrested, and we were supporting these 3 individuals, 3 men, with housing, case management, support, et cetera. I had they reached out to me and said, I want to have a conversation with you. And the conversation was, can we go visit basically the traffickers in jail? Because the word back at home is that we are ungrateful that these individuals brought us here, and for good or for bad, we were better off here than we were at home. We were able at least to send a little bit of money back home. So there's those dynamics that come into play. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases with foreign-born survivors, there's that loyalty and that dynamic when they're, especially when it's a family member that's exploiting the individual or someone that they know from their same place of origin. Substance use also.
Sorry, Perla, we have a question about the last slide. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
There's a question about language on the last slide. I'm just curious about exploiter versus pimp.
I don't like the word pimp. I feel like it glorifies, and really what that I prefer to use the term that best describes what that individual is doing, which is exploiting another person. Does that make sense? So we really don't, and I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sharon, as well.
I will, even though I'm talking too much, sorry, but it comes back to the very beginning of the conversation. It's a really great question, Ayana. We use the term in there because I think it was what was used in the research article, but Pimp is a term that's been glorified for a trafficker, but it's also really important when we think about criminalization. What do we call sex buyers? We call them Johns, like they're everyday guys, who are just, meeting their needs. So when we think about criminalization, again, it goes back to that accountability. So we really advocate again for changing our language to appropriate accountability.
Yeah. And then in terms of substance use, we've also worked with so many survivors, particularly of sex trafficking, that used substances either by choice to be able to cope with what they having to be forced to do sex work, or there were some survivors that were forced to take drugs before they're victimized, and then during, and then sometimes unfortunately survivors develop addiction issues, and particularly as a way to self-medicate or to try to cope and deal with the trauma that they've been exposed to. So it's really important that any support that we provide takes into account all the different intersections and dynamics that are coming up. And there's no cookie cutter approach. So with each individual, it's really thorough assessment and making sure that you have internally, identifying what resources your organization has internally to support survivors, and then what partnerships need to be developed to ensure that holistic support. We can go to the next slide. And here I'm going to turn it over to Ermelinda.
Thank you, Perla. So we're going to talk more about the relationship between criminalization and housing, and the relationship between housing, gender-based violence, and how that's key to addressing when it comes to providing housing support. Okay, so survivor criminal legal system. Okay, so their involvement, so survivor involvement in the criminal legal system can oftentimes lead to homelessness. So if a survivor has been convicted of a crime, they can lose their housing due to different things, right? Because they're incarcerated, they may not be able to pay their rent. They may not be able to continue work, or they may also have that on their record. So if they decide that they're going to find new housing, they may be screened out based on their criminal history, which is oftentimes something that should be addressed with the housing legal service providers, because oftentimes that shouldn't be right. They shouldn't be discriminated based on criminal history or on something that they disclose to the person that is screening them for their housing. They may be ineligible for affordable housing programs, or they may not be able to make the income requirements to apply to housing due to their criminal history. And so going back to what Sharon was talking about, carceral trauma, oftentimes a survivor may have a hard time keeping a job to pay for the rent, right? Or they may not be able to really continue to be stable in their housing because they need access to mental health, and that can oftentimes become a barrier when, our mental health systems are very impacted right now.
Can I add something, Ermelinda?
Yes.
I put in the chat. So Santa Clara County convened a CDAW task force as a convention to end all forms of discrimination against women a few years ago. And this task force looked at 6 different issues impacting women. One was gender-based violence. One was women and girls in the criminal justice system. One was around housing impact on women. And I just dropped into the chat the compendium of those 6 reports that really have very interesting information. Again, all those different intersections: homelessness, criminal justice, gender-based violence. So I highly recommend taking a look at those. Thank you.
Thank you, Perla. Okay, so disproportionate impacts. So domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children in the country. And that's, due to many different reasons, right? Either they're fleeing domestic violence, or maybe they're, sometimes it'll be where they're abusers, or in some cases where there's intersections, they're traffickers. They, they kick them out of their house or at where they're living at. When, when we're not catching, kind of where we're not realizing sometimes that they are domestic violence survivors, and that's why they are becoming unhoused. That's where they face additional barriers, right? Because we do have shelters for families, we do have shelters for domestic violence survivors fleeing domestic violence, but sometimes either they don't know about the services, or they just, maybe because of their backgrounds, they think that they don't have access to these services. And then we have 66% of human trafficking survivors report being unhoused or experiencing unstable housing at the time that they're trafficked. And again, because this is they are more vulnerable when they are unhoused. Traffickers oftentimes use this to recruit, to, deceive them into, going into that trafficking. And so then formally, up to 1 in 5 youth in emergency shelters have been trafficked. Again, Sharon, I think it was Sharon spoke about this a little bit earlier. Formerly incarcerated people are up to 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. Talked a little bit about this in the last slide. Again, because, maybe they're getting turned around from programs, maybe they're being screened out from different programs, or even screened out at the point of screening when it comes to applications for housing, for their renting an apartment, or for low-income housing, for example. Almost all non-white racial groups experience disproportionate rates of homelessness, with Black and Indigenous populations reflecting the greatest disproportionalities. 17% of the LGBTQ plus adults report experiencing homelessness, which is more than twice the rate of the general population. So why is housing critical intervention to offer? So oftentimes housing is a primary concern of survivors when it comes to safety planning and making decisions about the future. Think about being unhoused with no roof over your head, no support people, because at this point, it could be that a trafficker, an abuser is, because of them, you're no longer connected to any support people. No money. Oftentimes survivors don't even have a phone to communicate or to keep the communication going with service providers. So it's really hard for them to really think about what they need to become stable with housing, how to think about, getting a job or going to school, when they're worried about where they're going to be spending the night or how they're going to eat. Some people don't even have vehicles where they can be safe, right? And so again, traffickers oftentimes use this vulnerable state to recruit, to promise a safe place to stay. And then also there is oftentimes lack of safe, stable housing can increase stressors. This could be like financial stressors. Maybe the traffickers or maybe the abusers are not, they're on the verge of losing their housing, and now, they're expecting the survivor to be providing more money to them through sex work or through other types of work. And so when survivors have safe, stable alternative housing available from the people that are harming them, they do not have to rely on law enforcement or carceral systems as their primary option for seeking safety. And you want to, so again, ensuring that survivors have access to housing is key to prevent and interrupt cycles of harm for everyone.
And if I can add, and you'll see in the CDOT, one of the CDOT report around the intersections of house for women with homelessness, there's a recommendation there to build a continuum of housing for survivors of gender-based violence, from crisis through stabilization to permanent housing and stability. And if anyone's interested, the Domestic Violence Advocacy Consortium worked with the Office of Supportive Housing to develop a housing gaps analysis that addresses for survivors of gender-based violence, where are the housing gaps? And so if you're interested in seeing that report, because it has the analysis, what the gaps are, and then some recommendations of some things that we could do, whether it's related to policy practice, additional housing mechanisms to increase the housing support for survivors of gender-based violence. That was a lot of information. Is there any questions? Anything that's coming up for you? And I think Sharon, no, you're good. I think that because unfortunately Elle wasn't able to present today, but I really recommend that you come back and hear her tomorrow.
A little information sourcing, if people don't mind, because we had you till 4:30. I was really curious to hear from folks who are attending. We had some really great questions, and I wanted to hear from you of what you've heard today. If you can identify within your professional sphere or even your community or societal sphere, different perceptions that you're seeing impacting clients that you're working with when we're talking about criminalization. If you're able to share what challenges you might be facing in terms of agency policies and how they are accommodating some of these intersections that we talk about today. I know that there's been a lot of movement in terms of DEI work. Certainly that's a large intersection, but when we're talking about criminalization and housing, I'm very curious to hear from attendees, and you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat itself. But it'd be really helpful, especially as we go into tomorrow, and being able to provide really targeted recommendations about what folks are seeing in your spheres of work and life.
Hi, this is Ayana, and I'm sorry, I've just been monopolizing the chat. I'm pretty sure people are like, stop, just stop. But my curiosity after seeing everything and hearing everything is, especially for Santa Clara County, since the percentage of African ancestry families is so low, I think we're at 2.4, and the percentages that we're seeing in the intersex between intimate partner violence and CSEC and basically everything else is 4 times, 5 times higher than the percentage. Why there are not more services specific to African ancestry in the community related to some of the issues that these things cause and are caused by. So if there are situations that are culturally specific, and I hear you, Perla, and I was like wondering if there was some change that I didn't know about related to pimp versus exploiter, because it's a cultural term too. And in some cultures, some of the terminology is different. And we look at it in a language capacity, but not necessarily in a cultural reference capacity, especially if you're trying to reach specific populations and having that be the focal point in order to gain rapport and engagement. So I'm just really curious, and this is just not even related to this meeting in particular, but just what is going on within our systems that we can integrate some of this knowledge and the cultural frameworks to be able to support the work moving forward. And if there are opportunities to do that, because I would definitely be down.
You want me to jump in, Perla?
Yeah, and I'll go after you.
Well, to me, I think there's a lot of larger system issues that really relate to how we create space of inclusion. And that even comes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, where we see intersections, you know, the school to prison pipeline. So even looking at young children, how there's disproportionate impact for Black students, which then relates to future opportunities. So I think, you know, we find a lot of providers who are trying to, you know, put out job descriptions, and they really do want to hire either individuals with lived experience, but also diverse individuals who can be culturally responsive. And part of it is that how are we building capacity, and how are we creating space to build capacity within these communities? I think that's a much larger issue, and it kind of intersects with a lot of how our systems are operating. I don't know if Perla, you could also.
Yeah, and I think I could, in terms of systems, I think the only system that I could speak to is around the service providers. Because I agree that there needs to be a shift in all the different systems that interface with survivors, and particularly Black survivors, and making sure that we're being culturally responsive to the communities that we serve. And there is a couple of things happening. One is that there's a huge challenge around advocate recruitment and retention. And so this is across the state. And so in terms of bringing on folks that have lived experience, we really prioritize bringing on folks to do this work that have lived experience, and folks that can that are culturally that can respond culturally to the survivors that we work with. And then one of the other challenges that we're seeing is recruitment is one issue, and the other issue is around retention. And this is an issue across the state, where advocates, there's a lot of turnover in different organizations, because this work is really triggering. It's very emotionally trying. And because of that, we actually reached out to a research group that put together for us a report, and doing a little bit of literature review and individual interviews and focus groups with our advocates, and came up with a report around advocate wellness and self-care, and really trying to tease out how else can we provide a space that's culturally responsive, trauma informed for the advocates that work within our organizations, because we want to be able to recruit and retain individuals with lived experience that have those, you know, specific cultural backgrounds. And it wasn't surprising to me that on paper now we have about 47% of the advocates that work with that were part of the survey identified as survivors of gender-based violence. And so that's also kind of recognizing that when an individual has gone through a traumatic experience, they might want to do this work, but it might also be work that's really challenging to do for a long time. And so those are some of the challenges that we're having within the victim service provider arena, like recruiting staff, retaining staff, and bringing in staff that can specifically relate to specific communities. And it's an ongoing challenge. So I would love if there's any recommendations that you have. One of the things that we're doing internally within Community Solutions is developing a BIMPOC Leadership Academy. And the purpose of this academy is to support current and emerging leaders. And so folks from our organization to be able to really step into their leadership roles and help us impact policy change that would hopefully, result in having folks that we need to have at the table to better inform programming for the communities that are being impacted. And I don't know if that was a rambling answer that didn't respond to your question, but again, aside, there's some really great, there's a note here. Yeah, there's some really good recommendations also that came out of CEDAW around systems involved women and girls, and really would recommend folks to take a look at that as well. The other piece where folks can help is when it comes to systems and policy advocacy. So for example, there was a lot of great recommendations that came out of the CEDAW task force. And one of the recommendations was to develop an ordinance to have a standalone CEDAW group that could implement the recommendations that came out. And there's been a lot of pushback around that. So sometimes it's as service providers, we're limited in the impact that we can have around systems and policy changes.
And that's the thing, that's the link that you just sent out, the CEDAW.
Yes.
Okay.
I also wanted to just flag that I do think looking at mentorship programs is really important, or even just exposing. We do a lot of community presentations to young people, and really, speaking about the diversity of professions that are out there, and encouraging young people, particularly of color. I come from the South Asian community, so I've met with, South Asian little Girl Scouts, and they were all like, wow, like that's, that it wasn't even within their framework that this kind of work is something they could do. And so I do think there's a lot of value even just in that. I saw another comment. So Jessica, you said your housing colleagues may be able to speak to that. So I'm assuming you mean to some of the questions on challenges you guys are seeing. Is that correct?
Yeah, before we shifted to this last topic, you had said something about just kind of collecting people's experiences about what they see with the barriers to housing. And I was just noting that, like, I don't work as directly all the time with that, but I have a feeling Bay Legal and Law Foundation probably have some systemic analysis of what barriers are for people.
Well, great. Do you know if any of your colleagues are on the call that they would be able to share that, or maybe we can follow up with them?
I don't know that anyone is on this particular call. Pipe up if you are, please. But we can connect about it later.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. More questions or thoughts about, the presentation today and how they relate to the work you're doing? Cool. 40 of you all stuck around for a long training. We really appreciate it. We hope you come back for round 2. I don't know, Eli, are you closing us out?
I do want to say thank you to Sharon, to Ermelinda, to Perla, to everybody who shared their wisdom today. Really appreciate it. And Kim, and we hope to see all of our attendees back here tomorrow for the exciting conclusion and some more great content.